Hi guys, welcome to Movies by McManus, the channel where we talk about movies, books, TV, comics, and all types of media in the context of the world it was created in. I'm your host, Greg McManus. Let's get started. So on this episode, we're going to be talking about Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the secret history of the 60s. Written by Tom O'Neill. So Tom O'Neill took 20 years to write this book. So there's kind of a lot to put into it, especially in a 10-minute review, but I'm going to try my best. So I'm going to get a bit into the Charles Manson case from his perspective, and just about the wacky things that kind of went on, and that things may not be what they seem. So the start of the book starts with Tom's interview with Vincent Bugliosi, who was the district attorney of LA who prosecuted Charles Manson. So what starts Tom O'Neill down this rabbit hole is that basically he catches Vincent Bugliosi in a lie. Bugliosi was the prosecutor who prosecuted Charles Manson. And in the trial, he says that the music producer, Terry Melcher, was targeted, sort of, in these murders. That these murders took place at Terry Melcher's old house because Manson wanted revenge on him. Tom O'Neill says this isn't true. There's evidence that Terry Melcher had been to Spawn Ranch, where the Manson family was, after the murders took place. In fact, Bugliosi hid witness testimony placing Terry Melcher there. So immediately we're in this lie, and we're going down this rabbit hole. Why would Vincent Bugliosi lie at trial? Why would he risk Charles Manson going free? Unless there's more to the story than we can prove. So before I really dive into this story, I have to explain two things. Two government projects. One is called Chaos, and one is called COINTELPRO. You see, in the 60s, there were a lot of political movements. There was the anti-war movement, there was the hippie movement, and there was the Black Panther movement. And J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI saw these movements as threats. So he had the CIA create Chaos, and he had the FBI create COINTELPRO. Both of these projects had one similar goal, that they wanted to dismantle the anti-war movement and the Black Panthers. And that's where Charles Manson comes in. Tom O'Neill believes that Charles Manson was an informant for the CIA program Chaos. And it's actually not as crazy as you would think. So how he kind of comes to this conclusion is very interesting. You see, Manson is released from his 15 years in prison in 1967 and gets a lot of get-out-of-jail free passes from his parole officer. Now, him and his parole officer have a very weird relationship. He sticks up for Charles Manson a lot. He also helps get some of the girls in the family out of prison themselves. So right away, you're seeing kind of a weird situation going on. Now, he took this information to a district attorney named Louis Watnick. Louis Watnick looks over it, and he turns to Tom O'Neill and says Charles Manson was an informant. There's only one reason why a parole officer would let someone get away with so many violations, because he was worth more to them out of prison than in prison. So Manson is getting all these get-out-of-jail-free cards from his parole officer, Robert Smith. Later, I'll talk about the MKUltra experiments and how Robert Smith was kind of involved in that. But another thing I wanted to talk about was the CIA operative named Reese Whitson. So Reese Whitson, there's not a lot of information on. There's not really a lot of information on any CIA agents, but Reese Whitson was a CIA agent who was undercover in the hippie movement. He claims he was planted in Charles Manson's family. Not only that, he claims that he was at the murder site after the murders happened with Manson, right before the police showed up. So we have two people, Robert Smith and Reeve Whiston, who have connections to the CIA and then have connections to Manson. So already we're kind of getting the ball rolling. One of the interesting parts that Tom O'Neill acknowledges in the book is that the CIA is kind of viewed as a conspiracy theory boogeyman, that it seems every conspiracy theory, they look to the CIA as some shady organization that's controlling everything. But he doesn't see this as a distraction from his point. You see, the CIA kind of is a shady organization. They've been known for corrupt things in the past, and they've been known for working with informants that may be a lot worse than Charles Manson. Since the CIA's inception, they've been known for working with some pretty disgusting characters. Operation Bloodstone was one of their first projects, and they recruited former Nazis from post-World War II Germany to fight communism in South America. Around the time of Charles Manson, there was Operation Mongoose, which used mafia hitmen in order to take out Fidel Castro in Cuba. If this organization is not above working with former Nazis and not above working with the mafia, why would they be above working with Charles Manson? You also have to remember that chaos in itself was an illegal operation. The CIA is not supposed to be working on U.S. soil. And as I'll talk about later on, MKUltra was another illegal government experiment happening on U.S. soil. I also want to talk a bit about the type of people that the FBI and the CIA uses as informants. And in regards to whether or not the CIA would work with someone like Charles Manson, you have to remember that they have a long history of informants getting away with some pretty nasty stuff. Whitey Bulger was an informant for the FBI for many years, a very disgusting person who terrorized Boston. Greg Scarpa, a gangster in Brooklyn, who got away with almost 50 murders because he was providing information for the FBI. So saying that they wouldn't work with someone like Manson doesn't make sense when you consider they've worked with worse people. Also providing the fact that Manson may have had some valuable information for them. Manson was a very big character around San Francisco in 1968 when COINTELPRO and Chaos were trying to dismantle the hippie movement. And he also had a lot of connections in the music industry. A lot of them denied it later. He was also a lot closer to people like Dennis Wilson and Terry Malick than they would later claim. And COINTELPRO and Chaos was looking into people in the music industry as potential communist sympathizers. So you take a person who has information that the CIA or the FBI want, you add in their history of working with shady characters, and suddenly it doesn't seem that ridiculous. Now we're gonna get a bit off the deep end, and I'm going to talk about the CIA program MKUltra. MKUltra was started in 1949. Originally, it was Project Bluebird. And basically, the CIA wanted to use LSD in order to create assassins. People who would, under some sort of LSD-induced mind control, would get rid of their moral code and commit violence. Preferably without memory of doing that, but we'll get into that. Now, I talked about Charles Manson's first parole officer. In 1967 and 68, he was in San Francisco. Now, Roger Smith, his parole officer, is a very interesting character. He only had one client, and that was Charles Manson. His main project was called the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Center. Now, the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Center was a very weird place. It provided free health care for the hippies of San Francisco, but also did LSD experiments on them without their knowledge. And one man, Jolly West, who was a CIA operative for MKUltra, had an office there. So you have Charles Manson, his family, in a place where there's known LSD experiments, and then an MKUltra CIA operative in that same place, who's also doing LSD experiments. So let's talk about the goals of MKUltra. I explained people losing their moral code in some LSD-induced mind control. Well, that's what Charles Manson did. None of these girls had a violent past until they met Manson. Whether Charles Manson worked for the CIA or knew something about MKUltra, he did what they were planning on doing. He succeeded where the CIA failed. Now, how does that happen unless he's taught to do that? And Tom O'Neill, he never makes this point, but he lays it out so that you make it for yourself. But not only does Charles Manson complete the goals of MKUltra, he completes the goals of Chaos and COINTELPRO. He wants to dismantle the hippie movement, and that's exactly what the murders did. They made everybody fear hippies. Not only that, he tried to blame the Black Panthers, which is what COINTELPRO wanted to do. Pit the Black Panthers and the anti-war movement against each other. So whether or not Charles Manson was an operative for the CIA, it doesn't matter. He completed their goals for them. He got to do what the government failed at. And that's kind of the point of the book. And that's what Tom O'Neill kind of wants to do with this book. He doesn't want it to be end-all proof that Charles Manson and the CIA were working together. He just wants to question these agencies. He wants you to look at these government agencies and the people who are supposed to be enforcing the law and keeping us safe, and realize that maybe they're not the best people. And that's where his criticism of Vincent Bugliosi comes in. So it's very clear that Tom O'Neill has a personal beef against Vincent Bugliosi. It's very clear from the beginning of the book. It starts off with an interview with Bugliosi that kind of goes off the rails. And it makes sense when you think about who Vincent Bugliosi was as a person. So in 1965, Bugliosi has his first child, and he becomes convinced that he's not actually the father, that in fact his milkman had impregnated his wife. He had no evidence for this, but still he harassed his milkman and wanted to force him to take a paternity test. It got so bad that, in fact, at one point, Vincent Bugliosi kidnapped the milkman's daughter, picking her up at school and taking her to a toy store, and then dropping her off. Eventually, the milkman's family pressed charges and everything was dropped. But that was right before the Manson case. So you have this huge scandal with a deputy DA who suddenly gets the biggest case in Los Angeles at the time. Now, why is that? Tom O'Neill kind of hints at his point. He thinks that this is the moment that Bugliosi was compromised. You see, the district attorney of Los Angeles at that time was a man named Evel Younger. Evel Younger had fought in World War II as an OSS operative. OSS stands for Office of Strategic Service, and it's a precursor to the CIA. Now, what I'm talking about, when he just puts facts together but doesn't really connect it, lets you connect it, he does this here. You're talking about a former CIA operative who is now DA, who wants this now compromised deputy district attorney to take over one of the biggest cases in LA. Is it because he knew Manson had connections to the CIA and wanted a prosecutor who was willing to lie on the stand, and Bugliosi had a lot to lose and didn't want to risk it? We know the type of person who Bugliosi is. A couple of years later, in 1973, he had an affair with a woman who got pregnant and then refused to have an abortion, even though Bugliosi wanted her to. So Bugliosi went to her apartment and beat her up so bad that she miscarried. This is the type of person who prosecuted Manson. This is the type of person who lied on the stand. This is a person with a lot to lose, with no moral compass. I think really what Tom wants with this book is for us to start thinking of these agencies differently. Just because someone works for the CIA doesn't mean they can't be corrupt. Just because someone is a district attorney doesn't mean they can't be an absolutely terrible person. And just because someone is a hippie cult leader doesn't mean that they can't be secretly working for these people. We need to stop thinking of these agencies as our friends, who are always going to protect us and always have our best interest, because history has proven that that's not true. And while I don't know how much of his conclusions I agree with, The idea of just dismissing them would be unfair to him, it would be unfair to the 20 years that he put forward, and it would be unfair to history. So what do you guys think? Did Charles Manson have some connection to the CIA, or is Tom O'Neill just some crazy conspiracy theorist? If you have an opinion, we'd love to hear it. Leave it in the comments below. And if you want to see more videos like this, subscribe to our channel and follow us on social media at Movies by McManus. I'm your host, Greg, and I'll see you next time.